To the elite American major, they were a walking disgrace. In his eyes, they looked like rotting garbage. To him, their uniforms resembled filthy rags, and their weapons looked like piles of trash. When this officer first saw these men, he could barely suppress a gag reflex. He wrote a single word in his notebook, amateurs. But he was wrong. Completely wrong. This West Point major had no idea that standing directly in front of him were the most dangerous predators in the Vietnam jungle. He did not know that what he called an unbearable stench was the very thing that could keep him alive. And he had no idea that within 72 hours, these so-called dirty ragtag soldiers would make him burn with shame and permanently rewrite Special Forces history. How did 5 Australians manage to embarrass the multi-billion-dollar American war machine using nothing more than ordinary fish sauce? Why were they willing to call deadly artillery fire directly onto their own positions? Forget everything you think you know about the Vietnam War. Today, we are opening archives American generals wanted erased. Watch until the very end, because the finale reveals a secret that became the foundation of Delta Force yet is ignored by official history. If you are ready for a truth that sends chills, then let us begin to understand the catastrophe unfolding in the jungles of Phuoc. 2 in March 1969. You must first understand the overwhelming arrogance of the American military system. This disaster was not caused by one officer's mistake, but by a collision between 2 completely incompatible philosophies of warfare that were destined to clash. American doctrine in the 1960s rested on 3 pillars: overwhelming firepower, helicopter mobility, and absolute technological superiority. The Pentagon designed a system that looked brutally effective on paper. When a patrol made contact, it was meant to pull back, call air support, and erase the grid square with napalm and artillery. This had worked in Korea against conventional forces, so Washington believed it would crush Vietnam as well, but the enemy had already changed the rules, while America was still reading the old manual. Viet Cong commanders understood the American playbook perfectly and created a terrifying counter-strategy known as grabbing them by the belt buckle. Instead of retreating under fire, they charged forward, closing the distance to 20 meters, then 15, then 10, effectively hugging American lines. At that range, air power became useless because pilots could not strike without killing their own troops. In this chaos, technology meant nothing and raw numbers decided survival. By 1967, American casualties in close contact fights had risen 40% over the previous year. The enemy had turned America's greatest strength into a deadly weakness. Commanders were frozen, unable to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. But tactical failure was only half the crisis facing Major Coleman. The deeper humiliation was that Americans could not even find the enemy. Viet Cong 274th Regiment, an elite force of more than 1,000 fighters, had operated freely in Phuoc. For 2 years, American intelligence knew they existed, knew their approximate base area, and even knew their commander's name. Yet every search and destroy patrol returned empty-handed. The jungle itself seemed hostile to outsiders. Triple canopy foliage blocked sunlight, hiding entire armies' tunnel networks, allowed fighters to vanish underground for kilometers. Locals, either terrified or sympathetic, refused to talk. Thermal sensors, motion detectors, and chemical sniffers all failed in vines, snakes, and rot. This total collapse of high-tech warfare forced a desperate decision. The command called in the Australians not because they trusted their methods, but because everything else had failed. Australia's force was small, barely 8,000 men, compared to 500,000 Americans. But within it was a unit surrounded by unsettling rumors. The Special Air Service Regiment, built specifically for brutal jungle war. The results defied conventional logic. From 1966 to 1971, SAS patrols ran over 1,200 deep operations. For every Australian lost, they eliminated 50 to 70 enemy fighters. American Special Forces rarely exceeded a ratio of 1 to 10. The Australians were 5 to 7 times more lethal, and they did it without heavy air support more astonishing than their kill rate was their awareness. They returned with precise intelligence, base coordinates, supply routes, guard schedules. They seemed able to see through the jungle. American command wanted answers. Major Coleman was sent expecting advanced technology or brilliant maps. Instead, he found men who looked like vagrants. His skepticism hardened the moment he arrived at Nui Dat. Australians preparing for a mission looked nothing like a modern Army. Sergeant Terry O'Brien was not checking polished boots or pressed uniforms. He was enforcing a protocol called unorth. This protocol had nothing to do with weapon safety. It was about biological transformation, making soldiers invisible to the enemy's most dangerous sensor, the human nose. Each soldier stopped using all Western hygiene products 3 days before deployment. No soap, no shampoo, no deodorant, no shaving. They coated skin and uniforms with a foul paste of river mud, rotting leaves, and fermented fish sauce. To Coleman raised on West Point discipline, this looked primitive. He mocked it. O'Brien calmly explained that Viet Cong trackers were masters of scent. American soap, cigarettes, and diet created unnatural smells. Even sweat betrayed them. To a tracker hundreds of meters away, an American patrol screamed its presence. Coleman wrote it down, but dismissed it as nonsense. He believed real warfare was decided by firepower, not smell. Then he examined their gear. American patrols carried 40 to 50 kilograms each, rifles, pistols, grenades, radios, mines, rations. They were walking fortresses. Australians carried almost nothing. Every gram mattered. They used stripped-down rifles, no flash suppressors, no handles. They avoided metal containers to eliminate noise. They modified boots, so water drained instead of rotting their feet. Even their packs lacked metal buckles. Coleman thought it looked cheap and amateurish. Bryan offered a test. Coleman walked 100 meters wearing American gear while Australians listened. He did not make it 30 meters. They counted 27 distinct unnatural sounds. To a Viet Cong sentry, that noise was a death warrant. For the first time, Coleman's certainty cracked. These men were not amateurs. They were masters of a different war. The most terrifying weapon they had was a man, Billy Nungara, an Aboriginal tracker. What he could do had nothing to do with manuals. He read the land by feel, smell, and instinct. He identified numbers, direction, time, loads, injuries. He was always right. These skills were older than warfare. 40,000 years of survival knowledge. Technology meant nothing against a human radar. Then came the real test. 2 days later, Patrol Sierra 2 received orders. Find the 274th Regiment base and transmit coordinates. Americans would have planned a fast helicopter assault. Australians planned 10 days on foot deep behind enemy lines. 5 men walking into 1,000 enemies with no backup. Coleman called it suicide. The commander replied that Australians let the enemy find them. 3 days passed in silence. Slow movement, darkness, only long pauses listening. Signs of enemy everywhere. On day 4, Nungara detected a backward trail. They were being hunted. O'Brien ordered them to leave. Subtle signs became bait. The plan was to lure the enemy into a kill zone and call artillery on themselves. New Zealand gunners were the key, able to strike within 25 meters. Americans considered this suicide. Australians trusted it. On day 5, a Viet Cong scout stood less than a meter from O'Brien. He sniffed the air, smelled only jungle and fish sauce, and left. By day 6, over 100 enemy troops surrounded the hill. Then the radio failed. Under fire, the operator repaired it by hand. Just in time, claymores detonated, killing the first wave. Then artillery was called. Danger close. Shells landed 50 meters away. For 10 minutes, the jungle was obliterated. 73 enemy dead, 30 wounded. Australians alive. 1 minor injury. The broken enemy retreated, leading Australians straight to the main base. On day 10, coordinates were transmitted. The 274th Regiment headquarters was destroyed when they returned. Coleman understood everything had changed. He admitted his mistake and asked forgiveness. O'Brien shook his hand and walked away. Back in the U.S., Coleman wrote a report urging adoption of Australian methods. It was buried out of pride years later. Colonel Beckwith discovered it while creating Delta Force Australian veterans. Trained Delta operators, their methods became the foundation of modern special operations. 1983. Coleman visited O'Brien in Australia. He finally understood the philosophy. You cannot defeat the environment. You must become part of it today. The history books barely mention those 5 men, but their legacy lives in every elite unit. They prove humility beats arrogance, and that sometimes to win, you must break every rule. When Coleman called them amateurs, he was staring at the future of warfare. He just did not know it yet.